Welcome to Self-Powered Healing. I'm Barbara McNeely, your host and the creator of Self-Powered Healing, where we're talking about how you can unleash your innate healing ability. This is the final week of National Podcast Post Month, or as we like to call it, NaPod POMO. Coming up this week, just before the end of the month, I have a healing story for you. You do not want to miss it. In this episode of Self-Powered Healing, I'm continuing the conversation about all disease comes from spiritual sickness. If you recall the last episode, I presented a possible scientific basis for that theory to be correct. I still don't think it applies 100% of the time, but there is a lot of evidence that our emotions and past traumas contribute to much of the disease and chronic illness in our world. I'm going to explore a bit of that evidence today. By the way, I have provided a few links to information that I'm giving you in this podcast episode. The links can be found on my website, selfpoweredhealing.com. You can find them in the show notes for this episode. There's a concept called ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. What is that exactly? I'm going to read to you from the Harvard EDU website. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These experiences can include things like physical and emotional abuse, neglect, caregiver mental illness, and household violence. The more ACEs a child experiences, the more likely he or she is to suffer from things like heart disease and diabetes, poor academic achievement, and substance abuse later in life. If you're curious, you can see the set of 10 questions on the website acestoohigh.com. The higher your score, the more ACEs you had as a child. I took it and got like a 7 or 8. They suggest that anything over 4 is pretty high. The study is basically the scientific proof for the estimate that 70 to 80% of chronic illness is related to childhood trauma. I have a disease theory to present to you briefly because it relates to disease and emotions and traumas. I'll just give you an overview. The theory is called German New Medicine. It was founded in the early 1980s by Dr. Gerd Hammer, a German medical doctor. Dr. Hammer developed a cancer shortly after his son died in his arms following a tragic accident. During his treatment and recovery, he started questioning the root cause of his cancer. He realized that disease within the body often is preceded by dis-ease or emotional stressor or trauma. And this was the beginnings of German New Medicine. He identified correlations between physical symptoms, the brain, and emotional distress. Through his research, he provided a set of principles that can help identify what symptoms and organs are controlled from certain areas of the brain and the types of emotional distress that had been experienced. These principles, or biological laws, explain the cause of disease, how disease develops, as well as how it can heal naturally. It turns out that trauma and its relation to disease has been studied quite a bit. I'm going to share some of that with you. Dr. Gabor Mate is a Canadian physician. He is primarily a family physician, though he has a special interest in trauma and its influence over one's lifetime, primarily because of the traumas he had himself as a young child. His book, When the Body Says No, is a fascinating exploration of the mind-body connection for many conditions and diseases, including arthritis, cancer, IBS, MS, heart disease, and diabetes. He says, every traumatized person doesn't necessarily become addicted, but every addicted person was traumatized. In fact, according to Dr. Mate, the more trauma there is, the more inflammation there is in the body. So children who are abused as kids, you can measure the level of certain chemicals, proteins in their blood as adults that speak of inflammation. and they'll have elevated inflammatory proteins in their blood, which makes them at higher risk for depression and for heart disease and autoimmune disease and all kinds of other problems. I found something interesting in a book, The Body Electric by Robert Becker. It talks about some studies that have found a high risk of developing cancer that can be correlated with specific psychological factors. They include poor relationship with parents, self-pity, self-deprecation, passivity, a compulsive need to please, and most notably, an inability to rise from depression after some traumatic event, such as the death of a loved one or loss of a job. Louise Hay made her life's work around health and healing. She wrote the book, You Can Heal Your Life, which is a reference guide detailing the mental causes of physical ailments and includes positive thought patterns for reversing disease and creating health. Louise says, we create every so-called illness in our body. Resentment, criticism, and guilt are the most damaging patterns. Releasing resentment will dissolve even cancer. We must release the past and forgive everyone. There are many healing stories that are illnesses that were a result of an earlier trauma, and I've talked about a few of them. In an early episode of Self-Powered Healing, I talked about Anita Morjani, who traced her cancer back to a basic fear of life, fear of displeasing others, fear of cancer, etc. I also had a healing story about Jan, who resolved her rheumatoid arthritis once she connected it to her anger. And coming up later this week, you'll hear Donna's story and its emotional connection. I often hear people say that emotions can become trapped in the body, and that explains the emotion disease link. But I'm not really sure that that's true. I did like what Dr. Mate had to say about the inflammatory proteins and chemicals that remain in the blood of those who have been traumatized. I firmly believe that our past traumas and emotions can influence our health. Thanks for listening today. You can visit selfpoweredhealing.com/November 2024 to find all the episodes for Napod Pomo. Leave a comment too if you like. Thank you to all that have been a part of this 30-day challenge. Beginning in December, I'll be returning to my less intense schedule, publishing 3 episodes each month at least. I also will have more healing stories coming up. Stay tuned. By the way, Self-Powered Healing is still looking for interviews with people who want to share a story of healing. Do you have a healing story? I would love to hear about it and see if maybe you could share it on our show. So if you're interested in sharing, then visit selfpoweredhealing.com/share to schedule a chat. You aren't committing at this point. You're just having a chat with me to see what your story is about. It will be confidential unless or until you decide you want to share. And if you get there and there's not a convenient time for you, send me a message because we'll always find a time. And remember this always, you are a magnificent being with powerful innate healing abilities.